Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
He's in the building!
Drink the moment. Drink it.
I said empty your mind.
Coquettish and coy. Ow. Ow.
What?
There's people that are dying.
The wickedly talented.
More than great. It was historic.
Crack is
What?
Oh, good for you.
I have to apologize.
One of the hottest.
Hello, and welcome back to The Reheat, a podcast that re-examines the spiciest celebrity news and scandals of yesteryear and asks, how would we react to the same events if they'd transpired today? I'm your co-host, Sarah Sahagian.
And I'm your other co-host, Sadaf Hassan. Now, in our 3 seasons so far, in the same way we've often discussed late night shows, a few select primetime broadcast journalists, I'm looking at you, Barbara Walters, we've referenced Saturday Night Live a lot. How the comedy sketch series has poked fun at folks at their lowest and their best sometimes, but a lot of the time their lowest. Britney Spears, George Michael, you know what? Anybody you can think of, they've done it. They've given them a hard time. But it's iconic for a reason. And with 2025 marking the show's 50th anniversary and a new drama film out capturing its early days, we thought it time to give the show its own close read. Now, to begin, Sarah, tell me, were you ever an SNL fan? Was there an era that you particularly loved?
You know, I don't love SNL as a whole,
Yeah.
right? I would say the thing that I connect with most emotionally is Celebrity Jeopardy, which
Yes.
is something I reference constantly. I think it's one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life.
Same.
But for me, the reason why it didn't really resonate with me is for so long, and even to this day, it was pretty masculine.
Mm-hmm.
And I also thought that while it was supposed to be satire, I thought sometimes the satire was confusing or lacking. It wasn't exactly pointed. I prefer satire that actually makes social commentary, and sometimes SNL does, and sometimes it's just silly, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I was never the world's biggest fan. I like individual skits and individual players. Like I will always be a Kristen Wiig fan. You know, there are people who I think are great, and it was really wonderful at identifying talent. But I'm excited to talk about it with you because I think you're going to get into this. It's a mixed bag. It wasn't completely a force for good in the comedy world, but of course it did a lot of important things.
Yes, perfect summary. And I actually completely agree with you. And here's the thing, I think we are both well aware, for most people, for a lot of the people who made it big, for a lot of our friends, family, SNL has been huge. Everybody,
Mhm.
most everybody can name an era that they really loved, that they snuck into their living room to watch a clip
Mhm.
of, that they watched as they got older, that was so seminal for them. I didn't really have that either. I think also because I just didn't feel like it was my sense of humor. I didn't really feel represented, but I understood that it was this cultural juggernaut, even if it
Mhm.
wasn't my personal cup of tea. So let's get into it. And as always, let's start at the beginning. I have to emphasize how very Canadian SNL has always been, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. The show was created by Lorne Michaels and debuted in 1975 with George Carlin as its initial host, which is pretty wild now. Now, Lorne is a Toronto boy. He started off as a writer and broadcaster for CBC Radio. It doesn't get more Canadian than that.
Nope.
He then moved to LA, working on a few comedy specials here and there, but SNL really was his beginning and end. The show, if you somehow don't know, features a musical guest and celebrity guest. It has a whole cast of folks who are comedians, and every episode is live. Throughout its history, the show launched endless comedy careers. I'm going to hit you with just a few names. And these first ones I'm going to name were all in the first season. John Belushi, Gilda Radner, Dan Aykroyd, Chevy Chase, Jane Curtin, insane names right off the
Mm-hmm.
bat.
Mm-hmm.
And then more recently, over the years, we were blessed with Bill Murray, Eddie Murphy, Dana Carvey, Mike Myers, Will Ferrell, Adam Sandler, Kristen Wiig, Amy Poehler, Tina Fey, Bill Hader, Seth Meyers, Maya Rudolph, Kate McKinnon. It's endless. That's not even half the names. And some of the series sketches, like the Blues Brothers and Wayne's World, also led
Yep.
to very popular movies and cult fans. Listen, it doesn't get bigger than SNL, is what I'm telling you. And let me double down on that, because in its history, the series has picked up 84 Emmy Awards.
Mhm.
Okay. 84, 6 Writers Guild of America Awards, and 3 Peabody Awards. In the year 2000, it was inducted into the National Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame. It was ranked 10th in TV Guide's 50 Greatest TV Shows of All Time list. And in 2007, it was listed as one of Time's 100 Best TV Shows of All Time. See what they did there? Now, as of 2022, the show received over 305 Primetime Emmy Award nominations. That is the most received by any television show. It's insane. Sarah, what do you make of this staggering success? And you mentioned loving particular sketches and particular performers. Did you have a comedian in all of this run who was really your fave?
I mean, Kristen Wiig obviously was just always great in everything. She's such a chameleon. She's a really talented actor. Maya Rudolph did some legendary stuff. I mean, I do think Will Ferrell as George W. Bush, I would say, probably lives rent-free in my mind.
Yes.
Like, there was a skit where they're kind of satirizing how Dick Cheney was the real president, like had the power, which they didn't invent that commentary, right? Lots of people said it before them. But Will Ferrell comes in to the Oval Office. Dick Cheney's sitting at the president's desk doing the real work. And Will Ferrell comes in as George W. Bush holding a puppy. And he's like, "We found this dog. Can I keep him? I want to call him Awesome Dude." And that will forever be my image of George W. Bush. That just Will Ferrell's depiction of him as just sort of this hapless idiot who was the victim of other people, I think became very mainstream. And I don't even know if that's true, but I feel like George W. Bush in part has become rehabilitated, in part because he's no longer the worst president of the 21st century at all. But in part because we remember those sketches, which were actually like very endearing. It kind of portrayed him as a lovable idiot, which made you sort of feel like he was almost a victim of mean, smart people who were controlling him.
100%. But then I think, that's the double-edged sword with SNL, where it would soften and humanize.
Exactly. And so then you're not even mad at this person, the most powerful
Right.
person in the world, who is starting all these wars, and you should be mad at him. It kind of just made you see him as a character. Like, that era of SNL really cemented George W. Bush as like almost like a professional comedian, even though he was a world leader. Like, remember Bush quotes, how viral those went in the early days of the internet?
Yeah. We'll insert a little clip of Will Ferrell as George Bush right here.
I promised that if elected, I would change the tone in Washington. That I would end the usual partisan bickering and reach out to my opponents, often with a helping hand. And lately, it seems to me that no one has needed a helping hand more than former President Bill Clinton. Accordingly, on Friday, February 16th, at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, I ordered a surprise military strike against Iraq in order to move his latest scandals off the front pages. Now, let me make something very clear. There was utterly no legal or military justification for this strike.
I completely agree with you, Sarah. Oh my God, what a highlight. I just love Will Ferrell in general. I love Kristen Wiig, but my personal favorite from the tenure of the show, and again, I'm just speaking for myself, is Maya Rudolph, who I just think is also such a chameleon, so fucking funny in a way that I don't know, I will never get over. And she makes an incredible Kamala more recently, but every character she's ever taken on
Yes.
And the way that she took the show and launched it into her own career, I love so much. I actually wish we got more of Maya Rudolph. But yeah, there's just so many incredible people. Eddie Murphy, also such a great one. Bill Hader, I love so much. Yeah, it's kind of hard to pick your favorite, even if you don't love the show. I think there is probably a comedian in that cast over time who has made you laugh, and that's really saying something. Now,
or not even just that they made you laugh, but that they became an actor whose work you liked, even if you didn't watch SNL, right?
absolutely.
Like, if you like White Lotus, season 1, Molly Shannon has a memorable supporting role in it. Like, they are really good at identifying talent, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. But their influence in the culture is that they find you the new stars. And sometimes those people are comedic stars, but sometimes they can do everything.
Yeah, 100%. I think that was the beauty of this show. It found people who could do it all. Now, even though today it's impossible to imagine SNL would struggle with such a stellar cast at the start, it did for a bit. I'm sure many of you know some of this history. It had a mainly cult following in the start, and some people didn't know if its particular brand of humor would catch on. It was very different from what was on at the time. But the team put in their blood and their sweat. Lorne Michaels has said at the beginning the cast was paid $750 per episode, and they basically lived at the offices. Even today, the show is notorious for its tough weekly cycle, which begins at 9 a.m. Monday with a sketch pitch meeting and ends at 1:02 a.m. Saturday night with the live production. So you really only get Sunday off. Now, in its first 5 seasons, drugs and drug issues were rampant on set, and it only caused bigger and bigger tensions between cast members and producers. Cocaine has even been cited by former producers as a, quote, integral part of the working process at the time.
Okay, it's like their coffee.
Yeah, exactly, literally. Now, in the first season, and you'll see this in the new Jason Reitman movie if you haven't already caught it, a writer gets so stoned they lock themselves in a room, and Dan Aykroyd saves the day by getting him out and kind of being like, we've all been there, buddy. Like, we've all been stoned out of our minds. It's totally normal. Chevy Chase, notorious asshole, but particularly on SNL when he was doped up and he started ordering staff around. His ego was really kind of what ran the set. And we all know, sadly, Belushi was lost to a heroin overdose while Chris Farley was lost to a coke and morphine overdose. Now, Daryl Hammond actually may have been the heaviest drug user, according to rumors, hearsay, countless different memoirs over the years. In his memoir, he wrote, quote, I kept a pint of Remy in my desk at work. The drinking calmed my nerves and quieted the disturbing images that sprang into my head. When drinking didn't work, I cut myself.
Oh my
So
God.
clearly, needless to say, the SNL set was really, 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 really deeply mired in drama and tension, but also drug abuse and mental health issues. And, you know, even though these people were making you laugh every Saturday, it was quite a different vibe on set and quite a different vibe in their own lives. But I mean, you know, we've talked many times about comedians sometimes being the people who are sometimes the saddest when they're at home, and you know, laughter is kind of the way that brings them out of it. Now, by the end of the 5th season, Lorne decided he wanted to go off and work on other projects, and kind of shockingly, I mean, the gall really, he asked if he could take a year off and the show could take a year off, which who would ever ask that? Of course, NBC said no and had producer Gene Dumanian take his place. Here's the big problem. When Lorne left, every writer and cast member left with him. Oops. Poor Gene was also fired after just 10 months when a new cast member said fuck on air. And which, might I remind you, is how Jenny Slate was also fired years down the line.
I know.
And I think it's such bullshit. I mean, for that kind of cast and for that kind of show, are people really getting fired for saying the F word? I mean,
what 5-year-old is up at like 1 a.m. watching TV anyway? Like, we've got bigger problems if they're watching that. And I mean, at least the producers didn't get fired when Jenny Slate said that. This poor Gene. I mean, how was that Gene's fault?
I don't know. And here's the thing though, the reviews were really bad. So Gene, I don't know that was he was doing a good job anyway. And the ratings were in the tank. Clearly, and we'll see this as we keep going through this episode, but Lorne has an impact. And I think over time he's become a little bit of a joke figure because he's so quiet and kind of cold and like the silent man behind the scenes, but he's known what he's doing. Anyway, so after Gene was let go, in came Dick Ebersol, whose style of comedy was way more mainstream, way broader, which didn't really sit well with the writers. He also didn't like political humor, which meant they largely veered away from talking about US President Ronald Reagan, which
There was
is
so much to say.
I was just going to say, such an insanely missed opportunity. Can you imagine the content that we could have gotten at that time?
Oh my God. Like that would have been, and you know what, to an extent, like it was probably the best satire that never happened because he was so theatrical, right? He'd been an actor. So, oh God, there was just so much that you could do.
Can you imagine if he guested on SNL?
As a sneaker upper? I don't know if he would have done it. I think his aides might not have let him, but if he'd been allowed to do it, he would have loved it.
He would have
loved it. He was a ham.
He would be foaming at the mouth. Okay, so for the 5 years that Dick was producing, we were gifted with the hiring of Eddie Murphy, Billy Crystal, who I love so much, and Martin Short, who I also love so much. So things were back on the up and up, but still, Dick, I don't know if this is something like all these folks would get this big show in their hands and they'd want to make it theirs.
Yeah.
So Dick also wanted to take a pause, just like Lorne did before, and he wanted to reconfigure the whole show. Of course, NBC again said hell no, and they went back to Lorne and they said, please come back. And he said, hell yes. But Sarah, I want to take a moment here to talk a little bit more about Lorne and what the hell kind of magic was he bringing to this show that he knew how to instantly bring it to a great place. And also, why does Canada produce so much comedy gold? We've talked about that a little bit before, I think.
I mean, I think Canada produces comedy gold because you got to laugh through the cold, right? And also because you have to have a sense of humor to be Canadian. You can't take yourself too seriously. We are a country that is right beside the most important country in the world. Whether you like America or you don't like it, it is at the moment and has been for a while the most powerful country. Who knows how long that will still be the case, but it is. So in order to be this country that's comparatively much smaller population-wise, and it's always cold, and you're beside the people that everyone cares about most in the world, everyone cares about their opinion, and by contrast, no one cares about your opinion. A, how do you get people to like you if you don't have a lot of power? Be funny. B, you just have to be able to laugh at yourself or you'll cry. Right?
100%.
So I think that's why. What kind of magic did Lorne have? I mean, yes, he's Canadian, and Canadians are really good at laughing at things, as we have said. But I think in part it was just because I think he put the show first. And I do think he cares about being famous in his show. But to me, it always seemed like he didn't care. Maybe I'm wrong, but he didn't care as much about himself being famous as the show being iconic. Do you think I'm wrong about that?
No, I think you're actually right. I mean, I think there's a reason that Lorne is not as much of a household name as he probably could be. And Saturday Night Live is. I think there's a reason for that. And also to go back to what you were saying about Canadian humor, I think you're right on. And to add to that, because I think this is what you're saying essentially, I do believe truly that being in Canada, especially if you want to be a star, you want to quote unquote make it, you want to get to Hollywood, you probably feel like an underdog because the possibility of making it over the border and getting to that level, you will constantly be told it ain't ever going to happen. So yeah, the best way to be okay with that is to be funny and to work really, 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 really hard at it.
Yeah.
And Jim Carrey is one of my favorite stories in that way, but I think you're right on. And I think the other thing with Lorne is that, yeah, he started the thing. So I think people gave him a lot of credit for that and trusted him and respected him for that because it is something special. Lorne worked so hard to get this show off the ground and make it the way that he wanted it. And I think the other thing is, too, when he was able to bring on such big names, people knew if those people are going to come for Lorne, then I'll come for Lorne. That doesn't
Yeah.
mean that you'll necessarily come for Dick Ebersol or Jean Dumanian. You're going to wait for this particular guy. So I think part of it does just become he's a calling card. That's what his name is behind the scenes. And it kind of worked well, I suppose, at least for a long time. I won't say forever, but we'll get back into that.
Mhm.
Okay, so with Lorne back in the throne, he decided to refresh the cast and brought on what was at the time unknown talent. So that was Dana Carvey, Phil Hartman, Adam Sandler, Chris Farley, Rob Schneider. Yet again, the list goes on. But at this point, there was kind of an us versus them vibe on the set. So that was
Yeah.
between this newer cast and the vets. And
Mhm.
it was leading to some folks exiting the show and also competition to win screen time, which was always a thing anyway. You know, you
Yeah.
wanted your sketch, you wanted more minutes, you wanted more jokes, you wanted more punchlines. But these new boys brought in a more outrageous, shall we say, youthful humor, and not everyone agreed that this was SNL's brand. So
Yeah.
frequent jokes were made about gay sex, anal sex, anything scatological. A lot of it was homophobic, transphobic. By this point, the network also started to get really, really involved. They were calling for big names like Chris and Adam to be fired
Mhm.
and questioning the show's high costs, if it even needed to be live, which is ridiculous. That's kind of the show's whole shtick.
Yeah.
Eventually, it led to what has long been considered the series' worst season ever, 1994/1995.
Yeah.
I think we've had some way worse ones since then.
That's
But do
true.
yourself a favor, go watch some of those episodes from that time, see what you make of it. Now, the following year picked up again when Will Ferrell and Sherry O'Terry were hired, and over the following
Mhm.
years, the show did begin to invest in political commentary. It
Yeah.
won acclaim for its coverage of the Al Gore Bush election campaign, as Sarah referenced earlier, and for a now, I would say, questionable appearance by Rudy
Yeah.
Giuliani after 9/11. But at the time, everyone loved that, and I can understand why.
He was America's
Um,
mayor at the time.
He was, and I think maybe what people needed at that time was for a politician to come on screen and comfort them a little bit.
Yeah.
And at a time, SNL also decided to take a little bit of a pause from the political commentary. So I think, in a way, at that time, this was a good workaround, actually.
Mhm.
Now, in more recent years, we've seen them spoof Trump, Hillary, Kamala, the list goes on. I'm not a big Tina Fey fan. I have a lot of issues with Tina Fey, but I loved her as Sarah Palin during the
Yeah.
2008 election.
Mhm.
But it hasn't always been for good, just generally speaking. While I'd say in the start, the show was excellent at critiquing the state of things, in more recent years, in its efforts to maybe sway the public, I don't know, it's become a little too sentimental and forgiving, and I'm being generous with those terms. I'm thinking of in 2015 when Trump hosted the show.
Yeah.
When he was
Yeah.
running, I mean, that was really an appalling decision. The show got a lot of critique for that. And
Yeah.
then a year later, when Kate McKinnon, as Hillary Clinton, opened the show, playing the piano and singing Hallelujah, I found it so disgusting. I was just beyond appalled, although I know a lot of people loved it. So again, speaking for myself.
I just don't know what they would have done. Like, that was the thing. Like, I agree with you. It wasn't what I would have done, but I couldn't come up with a better idea myself. So I just sort of thought, I guess you work with what you've got.
I guess so. I also thought it was worth being funny. I mean, this was too dramatic and it was too sentimental. It was a bit melodramatic, if anything. It wasn't funny. I want to laugh. That just made me sad. And also, I don't know. I'm not a Hillary fan in general. So again, but never would have chosen Trump though. But anyway. Now, still through all of this, the show has had massive political impact, with voters saying it often sways their choices, which has been dubbed the SNL effect. In 2008, an election day survey cited by Reuters found that 10% of voters made their choice based on what they saw on SNL, with 59% voting for Obama because of the show. That's pretty insane.
Really?
Yeah. Again, that's based on the voters of this poll. So, Sarah, do you feel it's a comedian's job to reflect on the times? Can we set a bar? How do we set the bar?
It's a lot of responsibility. So I don't know if the audience knows this. I was one of the early writers for the Beaverton, which is kind of like Canada's version of the Onion.
Yeah.
I was one of the first women writers, actually. So I've always been interested in comedy writing, and I've never written for a sketch TV show, but I have written for comedy publications and satirical news. And I know SNL often does, satirical news, not a reflection of the actual literal facts. It's a lot of responsibility because you have to be well informed about what's happening. You have to be creative enough that people know it's not real. And sometimes the line between satire and fake news, like satire and disinformation, is a little bit blurry. So you need to make it very clear. You have to exaggerate enough that people aren't confused. And I think we've all seen a satirical news story before and thought it was real because they hadn't made it clear enough in satire. Right. So part of it is you have to be ridiculous enough that you're not misinforming people, but also you need to have a point. You need to make them think. Right? There needs to be a point to the hyperbole. It needs to get at a kernel of truth. It needs to get at a true vibe. And that was something I found hard. And everybody finds it hard when they're doing satire. So you will spend hours in a writing room trying to figure out what to do. Yeah. Like I remember once, and I'm not going to get into the actual details and tell you who it was, but we were trying to come up with a headline about something Pamela Wallin had done, who is a Canadian senator. And we had endless debates. Like some of the headlines focused too much on her appearance, and we're saying like, we don't necessarily agree with what she did, but why would we be attacking a woman's appearance, right? That has nothing to do with anything. So it's a lot of responsibility. And sometimes I think that political satire, I don't always know if writers take that responsibility seriously. And if they're not going to take the responsibility of influencing people seriously, then I don't think they should do it. And that's one of my critiques of SNL. I don't know if their writers are always super informed. Sometimes they are. I don't love Tina Fey, but I don't doubt that she's an informed person.
Yeah.
Sometimes I do wonder what they're trying to say and if they actually know. What about you?
I couldn't have said it better myself. I want to applaud that because you just took the words right out of my brain. That's kind of the way that I've always wanted to explain why I have an issue with the show. I think they used to be better at it because they used to be better informed, right? And I think part of that was because I think especially around the Bush years, maybe even the Clinton years, people were more invested in a different kind of way.
Yeah.
And it was this huge pop culture juggernaut. It was crazy if you didn't comment on it, and so everybody was very aware. But now I feel like because in terms of US politics, it's always nuts now. So I think maybe people have gotten a little lazy, and I think as the show has struggled to stay on the groove it started with, it's never really found that place again. And absolutely, like, do Michael Che and Colin Yost really know what's going on? Sorry, but I have a hard time believing that. Those two don't read the paper. Well, who reads the paper? But they don't read the news every day. I doubt it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a lot of responsibility because sometimes you can turn with satire people against a certain figure and then someone even worse comes along. So I've done that before. Like I wrote a viral article about Peter MacKay when I was young for the Beaverton, and because he had said something I thought was genuinely sexist, and he did, but it kind of hurt him a little bit. I'm not saying only my article hurt him. It did go viral, but it wasn't just me. I'm not that powerful. I'm not delusional. But Margaret Wente thought it was funny, and I hate Margaret Wente. So that was a really hard day for me. But sometimes when you pile on these politicians, sometimes even worse people take their place. And so satire is a lot of responsibility, and you don't always know what direction it's going to go in.
Yes, that's hilarious. I think you're completely right on. I think it's hard to do. But yeah, you have to really give a shit. And I don't know that a lot of these people do now, but I do think, we've talked about this before, if you have such a massive platform that actually sways voters, it's irresponsible, in my opinion, to not take advantage of that. Like we've discussed, a Taylor Swift who has so much power. And as we saw this time, previous elections, when she does make a statement, it brings so many of her fans to the voter polls, which is so crucial. Use that. Take advantage of your power. Okay, this feels like a good time to take a quick little break. We'll be right back. back. So let's catch up to the present. In more recent years, the show has included more digital and pre-recorded content, some of which has led to plenty of hits, like, of course, The Lonely Island. If there's not a Lonely Island short out there that you don't enjoy, I'll be shocked.
Yeah.
But it's also led to critique and folks saying the show has lost the appeal it had way back when it was entirely live. But personally, I think one of the bigger issues that has long plagued the show is who is involved. There's the fact that it's long been run by white men of a certain creed, and
Yeah.
of course, the insane lack of color. I mean, Fred Armisen played Obama for a long while until Jay Farrow was hired. Okay, that says a lot. Here's what Black comedian Ellen Cleghorn said in a 1995 New York Magazine story on the show. Quote, "There's only one writer who didn't go to Harvard or Yale or Cornell or Brown. There's no Black writers on the show. This is 1995, and I feel like I'm in a really bad sci-fi movie where all the Black people already got killed and I'm next. I'm not a separatist. I'd like to be able to jam with somebody who's had the same experiences I find funny." And I think this is part of the reason that I know so many people could never really connect with SNL. This was not the kind of humor that people that I knew made, or things that people I knew joked about. And when there's nobody on there who looks like you and is in spaces like you feel like it's not for you.
Yeah.
But again, that was in 1995. The cast is more colorful now, but that took so long and way more years than that. And it was also largely in response to the countless objections. While the
Yeah.
show has become better at covering a wider span of culture, it's also long been considered not very funny anymore, as Sarah and I keep saying. And it's these new cast members, a new focus on being a little more PC, for lack of a better term, that often gets the blame, which I feel like is a bit unfair, but the same goes when it's applauded, to be fair. Here's what Kenan Thompson said to Entertainment Weekly earlier this year. Quote, "It's more than format changes, it's reach. For decades, SNL had only one, maybe two Black cast members. Today, I'm one of 5, and we also have Asian, Hispanic, LGBTQ plus members in our cast. It's not just about appearances. It allows the show to do comedy it never could before." I personally love the Bowen Yang hire more than anything.
Yeah.
I think that was so overdue. But by the way, Kenan is also the same person who said not too long ago that Black women weren't ready for the show, as in to be on it. So I don't know about that. Sarah, I
Yeah.
know you have thoughts on all of this. Please share.
I mean, it goes through different eras, right? It's hard to critique the show as a whole because every season is so different, right? Some seasons are more diverse than others. Some seasons you have a diverse cast, but people don't get to do anything who aren't white and male, right? So
Yep.
I'm thinking about Maya Rudolph when she first joined the cast. Wasn't allowed to do that much, right?
Yeah.
She really had to prove herself more than I think a white male comedian would, or I mean, even a Black male comedian would, right? So I think that particularly the racialized women end up having to really fight for airtime, which is unfair. And I mean, it's still a place that is rife with racism and sexism, right? Like, I'm sure a lot of it is microaggressions, but we know that a lot of women in the writer's room at SNL have had experiences of people shooting down their ideas or telling them that they weren't being cute. Like, there's that story in Bossy Pants where Tina Fey talks about Amy Poehler, who was being criticized by, I think it was a male writer, for not being cute when she was doing a bit.
Yeah.
Right? So the women are kind of there in many cases as the eye candy, right? Or to play the girl roles. So this guy has a boyfriend and this guy has a girlfriend in this scene. So you've got to be the girlfriend or you've got to be the wife of the politician. And they often, like, I just think of the underlying sexism leads them to do things like, remember when the Tiger Woods scandal happened and they had Blake Lively play his wife, Elin, and they pretended that she was beating him. And they had her in the background with a golf club kind of making fun of DV. And that's just so tone deaf and wasn't what was happening. So I don't know. I just feel like their allegiances, because the critical mass of people are straight white men, usually tips in favor of giving the benefit of the doubt to more powerful men. So you get a lot of these social commentaries that sort of feel borderline incel influenced.
Ooh, yeah, say it, because I feel like people don't want to say that about something as quote unquote cool as SNL, right? Like, it's a very liberal, cool, awesome, pro thing to be a fan of this show, when the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that it has its own conservative problems
Yeah.
and also backwards problems, like going back to the 90s when you're still making jokes about gay people. It's
Yeah.
ridiculous, and they're getting so many laughs in the audience because there's a real audience track playing, or not playing, sorry, there's a real audience there.
Mm-hmm.
You're so right on, and I think a lot of that stuff hasn't changed, and it is really upsetting when you think about them probably just checking boxes, because yeah, they need a woman to play the woman, and they
Yep.
need a black person to play the black person.
Yep.
Keenan was playing every black role for
Yep.
so long
Mm-hmm.
that it was disgusting. And I wonder if he often felt like he had to toe the party line and not really call that out for a long time, because again, it was just him. I can't imagine what that felt like behind the scenes. That must have been really a unique experience. I hope he writes about all of it one day. Honestly.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, you said it best. It's really disappointing. And I think, I don't know, I think now it's great because we do have unique sketches that are culturally sound. Like, I love the Black Jeopardy sketch.
Yeah,
There's
that's a really good one.
yeah, there's so many great ones, and it feels like they're listening to their cast members who actually get to have sketches pass through. But then at the same time, you get a lot of people saying that's why it's not as good as it used to be, because they let the people of color in and they let the queer people in. And I hate that. I hate that. That's not the reason, I assure you, because it's sucked for a while. So
Yeah, it sucked. It sucks for many reasons, in part because it's hard to keep a format we've seen for so long fresh, right? Like,
yeah,
it's
50
not.
years, 50
Yeah,
years.
exactly. How do you keep something fresh for 50 years? It's very difficult. I would also say the musical guests aren't as good as they used to be, but people don't
Ooh,
cite that as a reason for SNL sucking, right? Like,
interesting.
it's
Yeah,
just
sure.
we're not, in my opinion, we are not in a cultural golden age. So it would make sense
Yeah.
that SNL is not in its golden age either, right? I just think that the culture is recalibrating itself. There are lots of talented people, there are lots of talented comedians and actors and writers in the world, but we're really trying to respond to the current moment, and we're figuring it out. This happens all the time, that the culture recalibrates itself. And so monoculture isn't really there. There are a lot of really great niche shows and niche comedians. Everyone can find something they find entertaining, but monoculture is not in a golden age, in my opinion.
Well said. That's one of your consistent opinions, and I love it.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that just made me realize too, speaking of musical guests, I think the show has increasingly leaned toward what's popular, because
Yep.
of course, like anything else, TV struggles to keep ratings like it used to prior to streaming, and SNL has definitely suffered from that. And as I've said a couple times, and we'll say maybe one more time, it's a very costly show.
Yeah.
So they need that, but it also means that they end up veering away from maybe more interesting or controversial guests, which is what SNL actually used to lean toward
Yeah.
in the early days. And I think it really benefited from that. Like, I'm thinking of 1992, Sinead O'Connor ripping up the photo of the Pope. We
Yeah.
are not going to have moments like that on SNL anymore. Nowadays, the controversial SNL moments are when the cast fucks up or they make a strange choice. Yeah. Anyway, let's fast forward. What does the future of SNL look like? There have been so many rumors for so long that Lorne Michaels will retire next year, with the show hitting 50 years. And he has
Mhm.
said many times that he sees Tina Fey, who he has collaborated with on tons of other projects since, as
Mhm.
his successor. In 2022, Keenan said the 50th season may actually be a good time for the show to wrap up, since again, it's very expensive for NBC
Yeah.
and also not as culturally relevant anymore.
Nope.
But in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter just earlier this year, Lorne denied this, of course, and rumors of his retirement, of course. I personally see that man quietly dying on that set, and I say that with
Yes.
love, because listen, make of the show what you will, make of him what you will, but he did create something iconic, and
Mhm.
that gave us so many incredible voices and comedians. And there's something really special about that. And I think for someone to latch on and to know what they're good at and to stay in their lane for 50 fucking years is really interesting.
Mhm.
Sir, do you think it's time for SNL to wrap it up?
No, I mean, I think that we need sketch comedy, and I think we need satire. I just think it needs to find its footing again, right? If it were to leave, I would want something similar to replace it. So I do think that there is a need for an SNL-like show. I just don't think it's in its golden age, as I mentioned before. And I agree with you. Lorne Michaels is going to die in that studio. And that's fine. You know what? I think that's how he would want it. Live your dream, Lorne. You created this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. It's like The Bachelor, right? They keep playing with the format and finding different hosts, but some iteration of it will always be needed.
I think so too, and inadvertently it will always reflect the times, right?
Yeah.
It reflects how we move as a society, for good or for worse. And if they want to go for another 50 years, I'm sure they'll manage it, but it won't look like it did in the start. And I don't think it'll be live forever. I really don't, which is really sad. But anyway, this brings us to our final segment. Hindsight is 2024, where we choose the one moment that we might have handled differently if we were the subject of this story. Okay, so I've got a little bit of a spiel. Personally, I wish Lorne had never fired my precious comedy queen, Casey Wilson, star of Happy Endings, of the wonderful Bitch Sesh podcast. I just love her so much. She was ousted after just 3 seasons, just over a decade ago. Here's how she described it in a 2021 Vulture profile. Quote, there is a dark adage that floats around SNL. You either have to lose weight or gain it to be on the show, but you can't be in between. In the year and a half of utter madness I was there, I began taking antidepressants to lift myself up from rock bottom, and I gained back all the weight I'd lost and some more while still grieving my mom, who had passed, and trying to handle the Barbaras of 30 Rock. When I was not asked back for what would have been my 3rd season, I felt a rush of relief and utter disappointment in myself. I had the chance and I didn't take my shot, but I never cried. The relief outweighed the regret. However, a week later, an article ran in The Hollywood Reporter saying that I was fired for being fat, which was false, but clearly someone felt that could have been the reason. Okay, so on second thought, maybe it's a good thing that Casey didn't end up being on there longer, but I do think her experience and this quote speaks so well to what a tough place SNL is, and what a not very healthy place and toxic place it is. And particularly when you are someone who doesn't fit the white male Harvard educated mold that they seem to want everybody to fit into. Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that? And what would be your little bit of hindsight for SNL?
I mean, what happened to Casey Wilson is very sad, and it's not atypical for SNL. I mean, the women are there. I would say historically they were there to be eye candy, and I don't think much has changed, frankly. I think that is the primary purpose for women on the show. I remember a Julia Louis-Dreyfus story. So she did SNL for a brief period of time early in her career, and she has since then undoubtedly become one of the most accomplished comedians of the era, right? I mean, she's just been in hit after hit. She was on Seinfeld, but then after Seinfeld, she was the only cast member who really did very meaningful work. I'm thinking of Veep, right? Like, she is one of the most consistent comedic actors in the world right now. And she had curly hair, right? And that shouldn't be like revolutionary, but she was a conventionally attractive, skinny white woman, but she had curly hair. And one day she straightened it. And basically the executives pulled her aside and they're like, good news. All the executives want to fuck you now because you straightened your hair. Just keep straightening it, basically, was the implication, because that makes you sexier, in our opinion, and will give you more screen time.
What? So, I never heard that story. Oh my God.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously it didn't fit in for her. And Julia Louis-Dreyfus comes from an incredibly privileged background. She comes from a very wealthy family. So a woman like that doesn't have to put up with that kind of overt sexual harassment. And you know, no one should have to. So I don't begrudge her that privilege. Like, no one should have to try to make it work and flirt with male executives to get screen time, right? Like, no one should have to do that. But they've had this problem for a really long time, and anyone who departs from what they consider attractive, not even what is attractive, what they consider attractive, runs the risk of getting fired or being harassed. And like, this is a real systemic issue.
It really, really is. Wow, that really pisses me the fuck off. I didn't know that. By the way, Julia, who has been hot her whole life, damn. And also, mind you, Gilda Radner has some of the most epic curls I've ever seen in the very beginning of SNL, and who I think a lot of people had posters of in their lockers and fantasized about. I definitely love me some Gilda Radner. Like, fuck off. Curls are hot. Jesus.
Yeah, I mean,
But
I
it's
don't know if
point,
it was
beside the point.
Yeah, I think it's because they'd probably, my speculation is, had hired her to be a hot girl, right?
Yeah,
and they
of
thought
course.
in their minds, curls aren't hot, so you can be eye candy with straight hair. Like, I don't know what they were thinking or why this was said to her. But
well, even in the beginning, you know, while Gilda Radner was gorgeous, I mean, all the women were, because also when you're funny, you're even hotter. I do think she was meant to be the lovable goof, whereas you had like Jane Curtin, who was blonde and hot and had that voice. So they definitely always hired to fill in certain stereotypes and archetypes.
yeah, they did. And Jane Curtin is a comic genius, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, she is a genius, but I don't know if that's why they hired her.
Right. Yikes.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And she also had an amazing career post SNL, right? She has been consistently great in so many things. So what would my hindsight as 2020 be? I mean, obviously I would not have fired Casey Wilson. That is just egregious.
Yeah.
If you've ever seen The Hot Wives of Orlando, that
Oh,
is one of the most brilliant pieces
preach.
of satire I've ever witnessed. She could have done that as a recurring SNL skit, and it would have been better than almost anything they've done in the last decade. But they squandered that talent, so
Yeah.
that's on them that
By
they
the
didn't
way,
get that property.
I also encourage anyone who's a fan or who doesn't know much about her, go back and watch Happy Endings, but also go get her memoir because it was really, really good. And she talks a fair bit about SNL in it.
She
and
does.
It's quite revealing.
She's had a fascinating life. Her mom was an important feminist activist and advocate. Like, Casey Wilson has had a very interesting evolution.
We love her here. But yeah, Sarah, what is your hindsight? I mean, you really did just list quite a few.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I would
There's a
do
ton.
differently.
As always.
Like, yeah. Well, just because the show's been around for 50 years, I probably would have given Chris Rock more screen time. I mean, say what you
Ooh.
will, as of late, he's become more conservative, but that was
That's a good
somebody
one.
who was incredibly talented,
Mhm.
whom they underused, right? Because they didn't really know in that era what to do with racialized comedians. I mean, they still don't, but
Oh,
really,
yeah.
he subsequently became one of the most important comedians of his generation. And I didn't love his most recent stand-up special. I think that he's kind of become a bit more conservative than he used to be, but like, he's definitely someone who would have rocked it on SNL, especially in that era. And I think that they aren't always good at appreciating the talent that they have at the time, especially when it comes to racialized people and to women of all races.
I think so too. Perfectly said. I think a lot of the time, each time they had their era, a lot of the Black comics really carried the show. I also think of Eddie Murphy. I also think of Maya Rudolph. So that's definitely for sure. But you know, this also makes me think, here's one other thing, because when you have people like George Carlin, you want to keep them on. People like Eddie Murphy, you want to keep them on. You kind of can't, because a show that is on mainstream television in the US and is afraid of censorship, and you can't say one bad word, and you got to be really careful with what you're joking about and how you joke about it. And there's people who read the scripts just to give you notes and maybe say, actually, we're going to nix this one. It's not really a place where comics like that can completely thrive.
Yeah.
So, you know, the best place to get comedy is to go outside and go watch a stand-up gig, go to a comedy show. That's always going to be the best place. Maybe not something like SNL, though it's certainly, I think, always going to be a good place to get a sense of who you like and what you think is funny. But these days, I think it's not much more than a launching pad, unfortunately. And even then, as we've said, it's not been fair to a lot of our favorite comedians. So
I have a question for you. Do you
Please.
think that the Upright Citizens Brigade, kind of for millennials, became almost more important for producing comedy talent, right? I'm thinking of people like Aziz Ansari, who I know controversial as of late, but came out of Upright Citizens Brigade, and so did a lot of other people.
Yeah, 100%. Oh my gosh, of course. But here's the other thing, right? And Sarah's referencing a really notoriously applauded comedy group. Yeah, but it reminds me too that it's the people that you know, right? I mean, a lot of
Mhm.
these people are in the same network. They know each other.
Yeah.
They hire their friends.
Yeah.
That's how you get to be on there. There's really an in crowd, and if you're not in the in crowd,
Mhm.
you're not in, which Casey talks about, and Jenny Slate
Mhm.
has also referred to a little bit. But
Yeah.
yeah, 100%. Oh my god. There's a style of humor that defined the millennial era.
Yes.
Yeah.
And SNL never got it quite right.
No. I think the struggle with SNL is not only its efforts to stay relevant in all the cultural ways, but also it's tried so hard to hold on to the voice and tone it had in the beginning, but you can't
Mhm.
because that was of a
Mhm.
time, and that time has sadly passed. And maybe that's also why it won't last much longer. It's hard to say.
I mean, I think it will last. I think it's just going to be less culturally relevant. And you're right, they have to find ways to make it less expensive. Like, does it need to be an hour and a half? Does it need to be live every week? Maybe it'll be live once a season, or maybe it'll be live once a month, right? Like, I don't know. They're going to find ways to cut the costs, as executives always do. That's part of their job. And you know what? Here's the thing. I think executives get a bad rep for cutting costs, but they often cut costs to save properties.
Yes.
Not always, but often. So I get why they're doing it. Sometimes you only have so much budget and
Yeah.
it is a business. It's not a nonprofit. So you got to make cuts. And that's what I think will happen to SNL. You mentioned that earlier and I agree with you.
I completely think so. That's me and Sarah's prediction. And hey, by the way, that's why as evil as sometimes producers and editors feel we need them, they kind of help rein us all in. And sometimes that's the last thing you want when it comes to comedy, which is why maybe SNL won't be forever. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you to our editor, Evan Wexler. And of course, thank you to all of our stunning, beautiful, funny listeners. You can listen to more of The Reheat for free on the Seeker app. You can also find the show on the Frequency Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to hear more from me, you can find me at _Sadaf Hassan. Sarah, where can our listeners find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Sahagian Sarah and on Twitter at Sarah Sahagian.
There you go.
Yeah.
Write that down.
Why make it easy? And if you liked this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe so other listeners can find us too. And if you would like us to keep growing, we would love for you to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thereheat, where we've got some goods in store for you. Thanks for listening.